If you're missing one or more wide receivers this week to the bye weeks or injuries, then this is exactly where you need to be. We're going to go into every single matchup this week and try to find some guys that maybe you can afford to put in your lineup that will give you a little bit of upside to make up for those starters that are missing. Amon-Ra St. Brown, JSN, Puka Nacua, Davante Adams, Marvin Harrison Jr., among other wide receivers you're not going to have available this week. So kicking it off with Thursday Night Football, anybody here that we can lean towards? Yeah, there could be, but it's Thursday Night Football and you never know what can happen. Justin Jefferson is obviously going to be a start for me this week, and then Jordan Addison is also going to find himself as a start. Since he has returned, he has been absolutely fantastic. And both of these guys, since their return, JJ is averaging 14.6 fantasy points per game. Jordan Addison, 14.4. That makes him the wide receiver 12 and wide receiver 13 based on fantasy points per game since Jordan Addison got back. Over the last 4 weeks, this Chargers defense has allowed the third fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but the cast they've faced isn't the greatest in the world either and really hasn't pushed their limits. When you take a look at it, Alec Pierce had 98 yards on 5 receptions against them. Jalen Waddle, 95 yards on 6 receptions. Debo, 96 yards and a touchdown on 8 receptions. And then Darius Slayton a few weeks ago, only 44 yards on 3 receptions. So there's still been some guys that have been overall solid. They just haven't given up a ton of touchdowns. And you can kind of say the same thing about Minnesota's defense. Right now, they've allowed the fewest fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks. But who have they faced during that time? Well, Jamar Chase, when he's still had Jake Browning, had 50 yards on 5 receptions. Remember that huge first half in that international game? DK Metcalf ended with 126 yards and a touchdown. Then Isaiah Bond with the Browns, he only had 29 yards. Nothing really to write home about that. But then Devontae Smith, 9 receptions, 183 yards and a touchdown. And that doesn't even include what A.J. Brown did against Minnesota as well. But I'm going to have to list this entire group as a fringe start right now because realistically, who's going to be the guy every single week? Targets last week, 14 to Keenan Allen, 15 to Ladd McConkey, only 6 to Quentin Johnston, but he did score a touchdown. But the biggest issue is that was all in negative game script. Is it going to be that way against Minnesota? It certainly isn't going to be that way every single week for this Chargers team. So who's going to be the guy that we trust the most often? Now that McConkey has finally gotten himself going again, it might take a couple of weeks to sort that out. This Atlanta defense is very, very good, and Miami is going to have some troubles this Sunday going up against them, mainly because Tua can't figure anything out right now. This Atlanta defense is allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and it's a pretty decent cast they have faced over that time. The 49ers, the Bills, the Commanders, the Panthers. There's been some decent wide receivers that they have shut down. Prior to Week 7, in a game that was affected by weather, Jalen Waddle was on the up and up after the Tyreek Hill injury. He was the wide receiver 4 and wide receiver 17 with 17 combined targets over those 2 games. But this is a much tougher matchup. And with as poorly as Tua has been playing, I can only go fringe start with Jalen Waddle this week, knowing that his floor isn't nearly as safe as I would like. The way Drake London was utilized last week was absolutely abysmal, and I understand he still had 10 targets, which is very solid, but he should have had more targets, and they certainly should have used him better. In what world is it a good idea to drop Michael Penix 8 yards when he's got pressure in his face every single play and just chuck the ball 20 yards down the field hoping somebody will be down there to grab it? And Miami's fantasy points per game allowed looks a little bit on the lower side because last week going up against the Browns in that game brought that down quite a bit. But realistically, a couple of performances before that, Ladd McConkey, 100 yards, 7 receptions and a touchdown. Tet McMillan had 73 yards on 6 receptions. There's been some really good performances against this Miami secondary, and hopefully Drake London can get back on track. Darnell Mooney is a dart throw, risk, big play guy for me. Garrett Wilson is banged up, and now we're going to Ty God Taylor, as I like to refer to him. And when you take a look at the other wide receivers on this team, nobody has stuck out. Last week, Tyler Johnson, 3 targets, 3 receptions, 60 yards. Josh Reynolds led the team in targets with 9, but he only caught 3 for 29 yards. Allen Lazard caught 2 of his 3 targets for 16 yards. And Even with this matchup, the numbers don't suggest a fantasy viable wide receiver here with this group outside of Garrett Wilson when he is healthy. And based on the quarterback play as of recent with Justin Fields, I'm not necessarily inclined to jump on board with either of these guys either. So let's get Garrett Wilson back. And then when he's back, we can go back to talking about this offense a little bit more. Yeah, the New York Jets are allowing the 10th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers over the last few weeks, but I don't care because number one, teams really don't need to throw against them all that much. But number two, Ja'Marr Chase and T. Higgins are on fire with Joe Flacco. Let me read you these numbers real quick with Joe Flacco. Ja'Marr Chase over his last couple of games, 35 targets, 26 receptions, 255 yards, and 2 touchdowns. He had 23 targets last week. 18 targets, 11 receptions, 158 yards, and a receiving touchdown for T. Higgins. I don't care how tough the matchup is. Right now with Joe Flacco, both of these guys are eating. For Cleveland and New England, there is not a single number that I can find that suggests to me that we should even worry about Jerry Jeudy or Isaiah Bond anytime soon. In this matchup in particular, over the last 4 weeks, the Patriots are allowing the 7th fewest fantasy points per game. But here's where these wide receivers have finished so far this season. Jerry Jeudy, wide receiver 67, 37, 81, 46, 90, 60, and 31. Isaiah Bond, 87, 71, 41, 84, 100, and 105. Both of these guys are permasits until we see multiple fantasy viable weeks in a row. Right now, there is no consistency with the pass catchers in New England. And even though Drake May is playing fantastic right now, and some would even argue he deserves some MVP votes, none of these guys have been a consistent option every single week that makes our fantasy lineups feel all that better. For instance, back in week 4, it felt like Stefon Diggs had turned a corner. He was the wide receiver 21, and then the week after that hit a huge ceiling as the wide receiver 5. People were running to the waiver wire, and this was a guy we felt, hey, we can start him consistently from now on. But since then, wide receiver 56 and wide receiver 26. What about Kayshon Boutte? In week 1, he had 103 receiving yards, and he felt like he was going to be the guy in this offense. And then after finishing as the wide receiver 18 that week, he has gone on to be the wide receiver 47, 72, 88, and 56. He was dropped and no one was even paying attention. And now all of a sudden, 3 touchdowns over the last 2 weeks, finishing as the wide receiver 4 and the wide receiver 20. That's way too much inconsistency to lock in either of these guys as an automatic start right now. We're going to have to find some consistency with one or the other before we can start putting them in our lineup without having to worrying about them. But not only that, at this point, they're going to spread the ball around quite a bit. Drake May has showcased that. They have several wide receivers that they can get the ball to, and they've got a couple of running backs that are not bad at catching it either. After a brutal loss to the Denver Broncos last week, the Giants are going to get another shot at Philadelphia after just playing a couple of weeks ago. And Philadelphia's defense has been a little bit of a pushover as of recent. Over the last 4 weeks, they've allowed the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. And one of those performances that went very well was Wan'Dale Robinson just a couple of weeks ago. 7 targets, 6 receptions, 84 yards, and a touchdown. Even little Jordan Humphrey, he had 8 targets, 4 receptions, and 55 yards. So facing off against this team, once again, Wan'Dale Robinson will be a start for me. Volumes plus some touchdown potential with Jackson Dart, absolutely in a matchup that he just fared well in a couple of weeks ago. For little Jordan Humphrey, for you to have to play him, you're going to need to be in a deep league with a lot of teams and not a lot of options. Last week was the epitome of why A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith can never be sits, but they can never be starts either. You basically got to put them in fringe land and just leave them there. And if you own them, you put them in your lineup a majority of the time and just keep those fingers crossed. Smith was the wide receiver 2 last week. The last time they faced the Giants, he was the wide receiver 38. This was his first top 12 performance of the season. For A.J. Brown, he was the wide receiver 3 last week. wide receiver 21 against the Giants a couple of weeks ago. This was only his second top 12 performance. You got a couple of guys that can finish inside the top 10 at will. You've got a couple of guys that are also going to finish outside the top 20 more times than you would like. And I feel like we're just continuing the trend of inconsistent wide receivers because we got the same thing in Buffalo as well. Keon Coleman and Khalil Shakir, especially on a week like this, you kind of got to list them both as a fringe start. I do think Shakir is a little bit safer, but Keon Coleman, in week 1, he was the wide receiver 4. Since then, he's been the wide receiver 79, 42, 49, and 74. It felt like Khalil Shakir was finding a decent floor. He had back-to-back weeks where he was the wide receiver 15 and the wide receiver 22. But since then, now he's been the wide receiver 51 and wide receiver 47. Coleman is still going to have some touchdown potential, and he's still going to have some big play potential. Khalil Shakir is still going to be more of a target hog at this point. If I have to pick one in this matchup, it's going to be Shakir. And if you're going with Keon Coleman, you're risking it for a big play and a touchdown. Last week, Xavier Legette had 11 targets, which was kind of a shock to some people. So I decided to take a look at the numbers. And back in week 1 and 2, which seemed like forever ago, you really don't talk about it too much because Legette's been hurt since then, and Tet McMillan is clearly the number 1 wide receiver. But Legette had 15 combined targets in week 1 and week 2. So even back at the beginning of the season, Legette seemed like a guy that was going to see a little bit more targets than what people realized. But now we're making a switch this week because Bryce Young is going to be injured and out, and Andy Dalton, the Red Rifle, is going to have to start. So who's going to be his guy this week? Tet McMillan and Legette, based on the numbers he put up last week, are both going to be in the fringe column. But a lot of it is going to depend on game script. And as long as it stays negative, both of these guys should end up having some pretty decent targets while trailing. Chicago at Baltimore. And I just want to talk about DJ Moore for just a second because I'm a huge DJ Moore fan. I was a huge fan when he came out. I would have given anything for DJ Moore to have been drafted by the Dallas Cowboys instead of the Carolina Panthers. And it really felt like this year could have been a big year for him. And I find it incredible that Ben Johnson is this creative offensive guru who I have seen firsthand as a Detroit Lions fan, and somehow, some way, he cannot get DJ Moore involved. And I don't know why that is. Is it Caleb Williams? Is it Ben Johnson? Is it DJ Moore? Should DJ Moore be traded again? He's got a great matchup this week as well, going up against Baltimore. Last 4 games, 4th most fantasy points per game allowed to opposing wide receivers. The highest he's been this season is wide receiver 29, and this feels like one of the last chances that he's going to get. And if he can't deliver this week, it might be time to move on from DJ Moore, or at least he's going to be a permasit until we see multiple weeks of production. But Rome Odunze is even more concerning to me because this was a guy that showed a ton of ability at the beginning of the season and then all of a sudden has disappeared. Whatever is going on with this offense, Caleb Williams and Ben Johnson need to figure it out. But this is the perfect matchup to do that. Lamar Jackson being back is incredible. That's going to be a big help for this Baltimore Ravens team. And I'm sure for those of you that own Lamar Jackson, you're ready for him to be back too. It's good for Derrick Henry. And most importantly, it's good for Zay Flowers. Now, DeAndre Hopkins hasn't done much this season, and Rashad Bateman's going to be a big-time playmaker that every once in a while is going to hit, but a majority of the time you're not going to have any interest in. But for Zay Flowers, going up against Chicago, allowing the 9th fewest fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks, Flowers has been in a bit of a rut, and some of that may have to do with Lamar Jackson being hurt, but also even before that, he wasn't really producing all that much. Back in week 1, when he was the wide receiver 1 overall, things looked great for him for the rest of the season. However, since then, the highest he's been able to finish is wide receiver 26, and he's been as low as wide receiver 89 during that time frame. Now Flowers still has 8+ targets and all but 2 games this season. So clearly they're still utilizing him and trying to get him the ball. And maybe this week against Chicago, they can do a little bit better job of it than they have been. San Francisco is going to get a tough matchup against Houston this week. But the good news is it sounds like Ricky Pearsall is going to be set to return. No official word as of yet, but it does feel like everything is trending in that direction for Ricky Pearsall and Juwan Jennings to be back on the field together here in week 8. Houston's allowing the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks. And as of now, Pearsall is expected back. And I'm going to list I'm going to list Jauan Jennings as a fringe start until we know for sure that Pearsall is going to be back. Now, here's the thing for Ricky Pearsall and Jauan Jennings. Someone's going to have to get targets this week, and Brock Purdy is also expected back. And even with it being a tough matchup, Jauan Jennings is still a guy that I think could have a little bit of touchdown potential if you can move the ball with Christian McCaffrey and then target Jennings in the red zone. However, if Ricky Pearsall does play, I'm going to put Pearsall as a fringe start, and Jauan Jennings is going to move to a sit instead. Now, the reason for that is because last week, JSN had a really solid game against this Houston secondary, and I think Ricky Pearsall more resembles what can be done just like JSN in that Seattle offense more than Jauan Jennings. Houston is in the same place that San Francisco has been in for a couple of weeks now. Lots of injuries. Christian Kirk, he was out last week, still officially questionable this week. No telling if Nico Collins would be able to go. His concussion was suffered on Monday Night Football, so he's going to have one less day to try and return. I doubt Nico Collins ends up playing this week. Not going with Xavier Hutchinson, he hasn't done much of anything. And Jalen Noel led the team with 7 targets on Monday Night Football, but are we really going to risk him going up against San Francisco? Me personally, if there's no Nico Collins, I don't have anything to do with these wide receivers. If Christian Kirk were to end up returning, maybe we could take a look at him as a flex option, but I still think it's a really low ceiling. You got to tip your cap to Mike Evans. Losing him for potentially the rest of the season is obviously a killer for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but for us as fans, he's going to go down as one of the greatest wide receivers of our generation. And to know he's not going to keep his streak of 1,000 receiving yards going, I hate to see that, because this dude has been the epitome of consistency, even though there's been a big argument against him being consistent for years now. But the one thing it does do is it makes Emeka Egbuka a huge upside play now the rest of the season. And it could make Chris Godwin a really safe play when he returns if he is 100%. It completely changes the dynamics of what this offense can be and who the ball is going to be going to. New Orleans is allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers over the last 4 weeks. Emeka Egbuka, he looked healthy on Monday Night Football against Detroit, and even though that backup secondary was able to shut this team down, I doubt they get shut down for a second straight week going up against New Orleans. And Emeka Egbuka is a definite must start for me once again. Chris Godwin, we're going to wait to hear a little bit more about him. If he misses again this week, then I'm going to go to Tez Johnson as a fringe start. Touchdowns in back-to-back weeks. Almost had 2 touchdowns last week. Baker Mayfield, unfortunately, just overthrew him. So Chris Godwin, if he plays this week, he would end up moving to being a fringe start for me, while Tez Johnson really is only a fringe start if you play in 12 or higher team leagues, because at that point, he becomes way too touchdown dependent for me, and knowing that there's not going to be the type of neutral or negative game script in this matchup that there was against Detroit, I don't think he sees nearly as many targets. Whew, how about my boy, Chris Olave? He was getting tons of targets this season, but there wasn't a whole lot of ceiling with it, so I told everybody, Chris Olave right now is a hold. Just keep him on your team. He could be a good fill-in for the bye weeks if you have an injury, something like that, and hopefully at some point in time he finds his ceiling, and by God, did he find that ceiling this week. Over the last 2 weeks, wide receiver 18 and wide receiver 4, 17 targets, 11 receptions, 196 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. Chris Olave has been probably one of the best draft picks you've made all season. And guess what? He was in one of my must-have wide receiver videos. So Headliner Nation, hopefully you listened on to Chris Olave, and hopefully he keeps this up. Obviously, it could change at any point in time, but it is awesome to see him playing so well with Spencer Rattler. For Rashid Shaheed, I know some people like to take a gamble with him because of his big playability, but there hasn't been really that much of a gamble as of recent because it's been way more bad than good. We've got a really interesting matchup when Dallas and Denver faces off this week, and that is going to be my must-watch underdog matchup of the week because I am really excited to see what CeeDee Lamb and George Pickens could do against a really tough Denver defense. And it's even more exciting to see what Courtland Sutton could do against a soft Dallas defense that gives up a ton of fantasy points. And when Underdog posts their projections for this matchup, you gotta wonder if going lower on the receiving yards for George Pickens, potentially going up against Patrick Surtain, is going to be the best route to go. What about going higher on the receiving yards for Courtland Sutton against this defense? Whatever it may be, you can't play them along with us unless you join us over on Underdog. And it's super easy, it's simple to do, and it is a ton of fun, especially if you're a part of our community and you're watching the pick'ems that are posted weekly by Jake in his videos or over in Discord. And to get in on all the action with us, just download the Underdog app, use code HEADLINERS when you create a new account, and deposit at least $10. What you're going to get at that point is a super special pick'em that's almost guaranteed to hit, that you can pair along with any of the pick'ems we talk about throughout the week. And when you play a matchup, you are going to have a shot at $100 in bonus funds or bonus contests. Download the app, create a new account, deposit at least $10 using code HEADLINERS, play your first contest along with us this week, and enjoy the rest of the season of what we like to call in Discord a green wave. Denver is allowing the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers over the last 4 weeks, but they have been solid as a defense all season long. Now, Wan'Dale Robinson got him a little bit last week. Jackson Dart looked good. The tight ends were a big issue for them last week. CeeDee Lamb for me is still going to be a guy that we absolutely run out there. He looked great in his return. George Pickens, he's still going to be a big play guy. Even if he loses a little bit of volume, he's going to have a shot at a big play or a touchdown every single week. But this week being shadowed by Patrick Surtain, you got to wonder if he's got the upside that we've been used to. But for as good as he's been this season, I think he's earned a fringe start regardless of the matchup. But what about the wide receivers for Denver going up against a Dallas defense that allows the most fantasy points per game on the season to opposing wide receivers? I mean, let's just talk about it for a second. Courtland Sutton obviously is going to be a must start. He's locked in for top 12 upside. He hasn't been a wide receiver 1 since week 3, but he still has 3 wide receiver 2 finishes over the last 4 weeks. But what about the wide receiver 2 behind him? Because that's where people are going to have the most questions. Because of how good this matchup is, you can probably afford to take a little bit of risk with both Mims and Franklin if you want to shoot for somebody with some high upside. Last week, Mims didn't have as many targets as Franklin, but he did have an overall better day for the most part. He had 6 catches on 7 targets for 85 yards, while Franklin had 3 catches on 10 targets for only 19 yards, but he did score a touchdown. If they both get 7+ targets in a game that should remain competitive the entire way, both of them are going to have a shot at being a wide receiver 2. I feel like I should be on American Idol now, because recently when people have been asking me about the Tennessee offense, my answer is kind of the same for everybody. That's a no for me, dog. Indianapolis may be allowing the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers over the last 4 weeks, but there is no shot that I even risk any of these wide receivers for the time being. Maybe at some point we can get back to rolling with these guys, and maybe now that they've gotten rid of Brian Callahan, it's going to take a couple of weeks to implement a new, better offense for Cam Ward, a little bit more of a basic, easier to understand offense that's going to allow him to be more successful. And if that happens, then we can start talking about these guys again. But they've scored 6 offensive touchdowns all season long. The Lions scored 7 offensive touchdowns against the Bears in week 2. Indianapolis is playing some amazing football right now, and kudos to Daniel Jones, Jonathan Taylor, and everybody there associated with that team. Living here in Indiana, I'm not a Colts fan, but I know a lot of Colts fans, and it's a really exciting season for them. Tennessee's defense is allowing the 8th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers over the last 4 weeks. But take a look at who they've faced. They faced the Patriots wide receivers. Okay, some good games here or there, but not a ton to write home about. They faced the Raiders wide receivers. Once again, not a ton to write home about. They faced the Cardinals. Marvin Harrison Jr. had 98 yards on 4 receptions against them. And they faced the Texans. Nico had 78 yards on 4 receptions. So a couple of different things to take away from this. Number one, even though those fantasy points per game look really low right now, they gave up a couple of decent performances, and then they had a couple of basically bad performances along the way. About 50-50 right now. But number two, it's the wide receivers that do a good job against them. Yeah, they might not have a ton of receptions, but they're putting up a decent amount of yards. Because this is exactly why the fantasy points per game look a little bit lower. Right now, Tennessee has only allowed 5 receiving touchdowns to opposing wide receivers, but they have allowed the 10th most receptions and the 9th most receiving yards. So there is an opportunity for volume. Michael Pittman for me is the best start out of this group. Josh Downs, no word on if he's going to be able to play this week, but Pittman's been the most consistent player on this team outside of Jonathan Taylor and Tyler Warren. Alec Pierce, if you're looking for a high upside spark this week, Pierce could have a big play or two, and again, it might just look like one of those stat lines we mentioned before. 70 plus receiving yards, but only 4 receptions. Green Bay will head to Pittsburgh on Sunday Night Football, and we'll talk more about that revenge game for Aaron Rodgers during the quarterback video, but it does have something to do with the wide receiver video as well. Taking a look at the offense for the Green Bay Packers right now, especially for the wide receivers, Romeo Doubs is not offering a lot of fantasy upside right now, but he has 8 targets in each of the last 3 games. He just hasn't seen a ton of receiving yards, but in decent matchups, he has good potential. Golden continues to be a guy that has some high upside ability, some big playability. It's not turning into a ton of production, but you are seeing it a little bit more over the last few weeks here. There is growing optimism among the Packers that Christian Watson will make his debut this season on Sunday Night Football. And if he does, a lot of people are going to want to run out and start him right away. Me personally, on the way back from an ACL tear, which he has been way ahead of schedule for the most part, I'm not going to go with that probably in week 1. I think what you're going to see from Christian Watson is some big plays here or there, maybe 3 or 4 receptions per game, 60, 70 receiving yards, and every once in a while he's going to house one of those catches for a touchdown. But I don't think it's going to be consistent because him and Matthew Golden are very similar. Both are extremely fast. Matthew Golden is a little bit more of a prototypical wide receiver 1 because he does play with a little bit more strength than what Christian Watson does, but then you're going to have Romeo Doubs potentially in the slot. You're going to be able to move some guys around. And like I mentioned, you're going to have targets going to several different players at one time. So because of that, Christian Watson may not get going right away. I don't think this is the week to go ahead and roll with him. But if you're desperate for somebody, you could probably find worse options at this point too. And I do feel like it's going to be Aaron Rodgers' revenge week. Remember what he did to the Jets in week 1 with 4 touchdowns? Again, we're not going to talk too much about Aaron Rodgers in this video because he'll be in the quarterbacks, but directly tied to Aaron Rodgers is DK Metcalf. And over the last 4 weeks, the Green Bay Packers have allowed the 7th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Revenge game for Aaron Rodgers almost certainly means a ton of potential for DK Metcalf. All right, let's wrap it up with Monday Night Football. And unfortunately, I can't give you too much and I can't evaluate much with the Commanders because Terry McLaurin and Deebo Samuel are both questionable and missed last week. No clue whether or not both of these guys are going to end up returning. Now, if Deebo Samuel were to play, he'll be listed as a fringe start, only because I don't know exactly how healthy he is, but I have to assume that Marcus Mariota would look his way if he does in fact end up starting over Jayden Daniels, with Jayden Daniels being banged up this week. As excited as I am for Terry McLaurin, this may be the one game where you say, hey, I'm going to wait to see how he looks coming back, especially if it's Mariota as the quarterback, and I might look to somebody else for next week. But if you're craving a big play here or there and you're looking for somebody to just throw into your lineup because you don't have any other options, Terry McLaurin could still find the end zone. The Kansas City wide receivers are going to have a great matchup going up against Washington. Over the last 4 weeks are allowing the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Here's what we're going to do with these wide receivers moving forward. And I know some of the jokes will write themselves in the comments. Just be respectful, people. I appreciate it. Rashee Rice, he is going to be a start. He doesn't have a ton of big play potential, but what you do see from him is the potential for a good amount of volume and for red zone usage, which is one of the things that I didn't account for last week, is how he would be utilized inside the 20, not just the big plays and not just the volume alone. For Hollywood Brown, he's going to be a fringe because he's going to have touchdown potential every single week. We saw it last week. I know a lot of people are still questioning myself on what I had to say about Rashee Rice, but I also did tell everyone that I liked Hollywood Brown to score a touchdown as well, and he did. So Pat on the back for that one. Xavier Worthy, he's going to be fringe though because of his big play potential. In some tougher matchups, we might sit Brown and Worthy and just go with Rice. With some easier matchups, you're probably going to see exactly what you have right here. Headliner Nation, that's going to do it for my start and sit analysis at the wide receiver position this week. Still got quarterbacks to come, so make sure you like the video, subscribe, and turn on the bell notification so if you need help with quarterbacks this week, you can get that when you see that video pop up on your timeline. But if you've missed any of the other videos this week and any other content, make sure you go back and check all of that out so you can see exactly what you should be doing with your lineup in Week 8. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.